Nitin Pai is the co-founder and director of the Takshashila Institution, which is an independent think tank and a public policy school based in Bangalore. He's always the first person to advocate for things like individual liberty, free markets, the power of reason. So, naturally, when he wanted more regulation in social media instead of less, I wanted to understand why. Oh, and on a side note, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how long these podcasts should be, and this is an attempt at a slightly shorter format, so this episode runs about an hour long. I hope you enjoy listening. Hi Nitin, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Deepak, I'm glad that you're here to disagree with me today.
I want, for at least listeners, to give some context around how we ended up here and why we picked this subject in particular. So, at Takshashila, which Nitin is the co-founder of, every Thursday there is an event called the Tank Scrub, where you can come and sort of chime in and be part of discussions about practically everything, scrubbing effectively the bottom of the tank. And a few weeks ago, somebody was talking about regulations around devices like the Neuralink. And Nitin said something very interesting as part of that conversation. He said, I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago, but if I could go back in time to 10 years back when social media was just sort of coming into the Indian landscape, I would have insisted that regulations happen differently and a lot more stringently than the sort of laissez-faire approach that I took at the time. Approximately, Nitin, this is my memory of what you said. Is that a right characterization?
That's more or less right, yeah.
Yeah. And that sort of got me quizzed because traditionally you seem to be the person who follows the arrow of freedom. And this seems in counter to that. And when I hear objections for use of social media, they range in all types of issues. So you could have some people say things like privacy is a problem, you need to regulate the privacy side of it. Some people say it's big tech, or it's censorship, or it diminishes the ability of states to govern, or it makes the landscape very polarized, or people get very anxious and depressed. There's all types of sort of issues with social media, right? But the argument you took, and as a sort of add-on to the Neuralink problem, is the theft of consent. That is, when you are using these platforms, you are not completely consenting to the platform itself. And that is the sort of seed that will drive the regulatory aspect. So I'm going to pause here and allow you to sort of take over the conversation. But is that an accurate characterization of why you think regulation should be more stringent here?
I think before we talk about regulation, social media, etc., I think we should step back and come at it from the perspective of why do we think rights are ought to be protected, or freedom is important and liberty is important, right? I think we start from the idea that an individual is at the center of society because the individual is capable of reason, right? This is the Enlightenment idea of an individual. And on the capacity for reason, the fact that human beings can exercise reason as individuals, can choose what is right and wrong for them, you construct two important edifices. One edifice you construct is of liberal democracy, where you say that, look, you know what's good for you, you know what's bad for you, and therefore you can exercise choice. And you can therefore exercise choice in the way your society is organized, the way the rules are made, who is in, who is out. All of that depends on you, because you can make that choice. You're capable of making that choice. So, and therefore you have rights, right? Why do you think you have rights? I mean, if you believe that an entity is incapable of reason, of looking out for its own interests, why would you assign rights to it, right? That's why you don't assign rights to a dog, a pet dog or a pet animal, because it's not capable of, limited capability of, right. Talking to my dog, I think he thinks he has great amount of reason, but, we know that there's only so much of reason non-reasoning creatures can, therefore they don't have rights, right? They are not capable of having rights. So you create liberal democracy, right? The other edifice you create is of free markets, because if you know how much to value the stuff that you have, and somebody else is also able to value the stuff that you have, there's a difference in the valuation of the same thing, and that's the basis for exchange, right? We can voluntarily exchange. I would voluntarily give you something which I think is less valuable in order to get something from you which is more valuable. So if I were to sell you a watch, and if I think that the watch to me is, the value is only about 2,000 rupees, and you come up to me and say, here's 2,500 rupees, I'll willingly sell you the watch.
Right.
Because your 2,500 rupees is more valuable to me than the watch that I have. The basis of this is reason. I'm able to put an objective value or even a subjective value on that watch. because I'm capable of reason. I'm making that call myself. Right? That's the theory. Now, for well over, I suppose, up to the year 2000, we believed in this theory of how an individual makes decisions and how individual reason works. And therefore, we constructed elaborate theories of democracy and markets. Now, Kahneman and Tversky, I think, come to this and show that the way the brain works is not what it was advertised. Right? The idea that a rational person is a person who weighs the pros and cons and decides on the basis of the weighing of pros and cons is a theoretical construct. There is no rational person who fits that definition of rationality. And therefore, everything that you've created on that basis of rationality needs to be challenged. You don't have to throw it away. It's not invalid on day one. But at least you have to question it. So, it begs the question of what is it how do humans make decisions now? So, I think Tversky has thrown it, and then Jonathan Haidt, whom you quoted, has a new book also on this, right?
Yeah.
On the age of anxiety, anxious generation or something
Correct.
like that. But basically, the modern understanding of how humans make decisions is that there is an intuitive process which is driven by social conditions. There's social intuition, and then there's a slow brain which justifies the intuition that you have. So this fast and slow brain understanding of how decisions are made by humans transforms the way we think of rationality in human beings. So, for example, you don't vote based on the pros and cons of the candidate or the issues that you have.
Right.
You vote on the basis of who else is voting for what. Who do you think is a good candidate, right? Or who do you think is winning? That's why parties go and do this hawa business. Similarly, in markets, people don't look at the specifications of an Android or an iPhone. Like my kids come and say, we need an iPhone because everybody has an iPhone.
Correct.
They don't look at the processor or whether it has a USB port or whatever, right? So, now, when you have these two things operating, you have to relook at rights. You have to look at what liberal democracy means. And how do we... It's not, again, as I said, it's not an argument to throw away liberal democracy and free markets. But this edifice is challenged, right? And we have to now look at building those desirable instruments. Whatever democracy gives you, markets give you. We have to relook at those goals which they achieve in the light of the way we know how the brain functions and design the intermediate architecture. Because if you say that, the representative democracy built in 1779 in the United States, it's still the best way to govern a human society 300 years later, I would question that, right? It's technology, Democracy, there's a lot of democracy is technology. Representative democracy is technology. If technology for moving from one place to the other has changed, to recording your thoughts has changed, moving information from one place to the other has changed, why do we think, the technology of, how we govern ourselves needs to be the same?
Right. Interesting. And if I'll spend a few minutes trying to just deconstruct that first bit, which is the assumption that rights draw from ability to reason. I don't know why, but I've always had the intuitive sense that, in fact, rights are beyond reason. In that, one example, like simplest, would be something like saying the right to life has nothing to do with reason at all. You have the right to life a priori. It has nothing to do with any logical way that we conclude that this is just the best way to be. And I give it to you so I can have it for myself. That's one way to approach it. But also in the example you gave where if the market values something at 2,000 rupees and there were an unreasonable person who was willing to pay a significant amount of money for it, even of poor constitution or poor reasoning, the right to be unreasonable is one that we afford that person. That is the free market. A free market is one where you can make an unreasonable decision, and that's fine as long as all parties consent. So is it really coming from reason, or is it more just Lockean, where you're saying, my body, then the fruits of my labor, so my property.
See,
and then
the first one about rights coming from reason. See, you can't have an arbitrary reason for assigning rights, right? Like, you said, for example, you assign the right to life just because you also want to have that right. That's a reason-based thing because you've made that construction based on using reason. The reason here is that I also want to live, therefore I want to, that's reason. But, why is it that we don't think trees have rights or stones have rights? You could say that, I come from a culture, I come from a philosophy where all sentient and insentient beings also have rights. Right? You could say that, but you're not going to convince me, right? So we need to be able to have a mutually acceptable grammar and language of understanding what rights, at least where they come from. We can disagree what those rights are, how much they should be,
Right.
but it can't be, just can't pull something arbitrary and say this has rights. So I think the idea, even in the past, that humans, humans have this right, humans are God's creation, God's chosen people.
Right.
I mean, that's also contestable, right? Humans have rights because they have God's chosen people. That is contestable. I mean, why do you think that God chose you, if there is a God and that God chose you, and why didn't the God choose a broccoli, right? I mean, the broccoli could probably say that, if it had reason, it could say I'm God's chosen organism. But what I'm saying is, you can't arbitrarily assign rights to broccoli, right? Because
and the use of reason is not arbitrary.
Use of reason is probably justifiable on the basis of, you can now, a right has to also come with some kind of an obligation, right? Now, let's say you assign a right to life to a dog, okay, which means the dog should also accept that other dogs should have the right to life. But the dog doesn't believe that, right? I mean, dogs go and kill other dogs and kill other animals. So it's not able to exercise, that right in a way that works for other people. It can exercise its own right to life, but it can't exercise other rights to life. So therefore, you need that, I would call it the hurdle of rationality before you can say, look, this particular entity should have rights or has rights, right? Now, this definition runs into difficulty when you talk about things like artificial intelligence, because you could argue that artificial intelligence can have rationality and therefore it should have rights. That's grey area. I understand. I haven't thought about it entirely. There are good reasons to say why AI shouldn't have rights, because it's inanimate. It's not a live creature. But at a point in the future where AI can be self-replicating, can build replicate itself, can do selection, can have all sorts of things which life has. Maybe at that time, should we think of those AIs having rights? I don't know. But it is a tricky question. I mean,
no, and also on the reason front, just like the example of a non-human, so out of species having extreme rationality AI, you have within species not having rationality, which is...
that's the one which you mentioned, right? When you said somebody is unreasonable and willing to pay you a lot of money. Actually, that's not unreasonable, right? That's what you call the reason being subjective, right? Like, and that's the interesting part of why markets work. Because if I were to look at the pen, for example, right? I think it's 2,500 rupees. Somebody else thinks it's 6,000 rupees. Somebody else is a collector who thinks it should be worth 20,000 rupees, right? Now, the fact that there is a difference in perception of value makes markets work. And each of us place the value according to our own reason. I might be ignorant of, it's maybe, Jawaharlal Nehru used it to sign some, maybe his autobiography or something like that, right? So that pen or that thing is very valuable because of that. Somebody else doesn't really care about Jawaharlal Nehru, doesn't know anything about it. He'd say, look, I don't care about it. I mean, I'm going to pay 20 rupees for it.
Can humans ever be unreasonable?
Can humans
ever be unreasonable?
I think from my understanding, and I'm an electrical engineer, not a psychologist or a cognitive science person, from an electrical engineer's perspective, it looks like we are on a spectrum of reason. Right? That we are capable of reason, we're capable of extreme rationality in certain cases, and we are also capable of extreme irrationality in other cases. When I say irrationality, I'm saying you just make a decision based on just,
math.
Rationality is math, but irrationality, right? Like, suddenly you are walking on a particular street, a kid comes and begs some money, and you just give money, instinctively. It's a very instinctive thing. You haven't even thought about it, and you just give the money. So that's, in a way, it's irrational. I mean,
but it's reasonable.
Yeah, reasonable is like how much money you give to the thing. But that's semantics. But what I'm saying is that whether it's rationality or reasonable, you tend to be on a spectrum. You're capable of both, right? You're capable of reason-based and rational kind of decisions. You're also capable of irrational decisions. I think I'm not making an argument that a person should be hyper-rational, Mr. Spock, all the time. That will make a very, very dry world. Right? A lot of what makes the world interesting is there are different kinds of rationalities and they clash, and you have love, you have art, you have music, you have culture, you have great human achievements, which comes from the fact that we are not always rational and not everyone is uniformly rational. But there are certain areas where rationality is important. In your personal life, there might be situations where you have to look at medical treatment, or what kind of choices do you want to make about your future? Which insurance policy do you need to buy insurance policy? What school do you want to go to? What school do you want to send your children to? So there is an element of rationality which is required, and that's driven by self-interest. But a more important domain where rationality is called for is in the public domain. Because you could make a personal decision to, worship this god or that god, or take this treatment or that treatment. Let's use treatment as an example, right? And you believe that sitting under a banana tree and for overnight is going to cure you of measles, right? And you believe, and someone has told you, fine, you go and sit under a banana tree overnight and see whether it cures you of measles. If it cures you of measles, great, I'm happy for you. If it doesn't, then too bad. But you made that choice. But let's say we're making a public health choice, and your government. And now you need to have a measles prevention policy.
Right.
And someone comes and tells you, sit under a banana tree overnight, make all the children sit under. I mean, that's not borne out by evidence, right? So now you'll have to make a decision to say, okay, how do we tackle measles? Where does it come from? How do maybe we vaccinate kids against measles? We give treatment for measles. If you're giving vaccination, do you double blind test it? If you're giving medicine treatment, are you going to test it? Is it a proven treatment? What's the accuracy of that treatment, and so on, right? So you use extreme amount of rationality because it's a public thing. Because the decision you're making as a public decision maker doesn't affect only you. It affects everybody, right? And that's not the only thing. How do we convince each other? Because you might be the guy who says, look, banana tree. And I might be the guy who says vaccine. We need to be able to convince each other that, look, let's agree on a common approach to solve measles.
Correct.
Right? And the only common approach we'll have is rationality, right? We'll say, look, let's test it out. If it works, it works. Banana tree is fine. Medicine is fine. Whatever works, works. So it might, so you should be able to say that, look, I'm a proponent of banana trees for measles, but let's look at the accuracy.
Yeah, so I want to leap from here to social media, but before that, just two sort of side notes. One, I understand why you started from rights, because then the defense of the rights is sort of what the state's primary job is, and that's how we can sort of look at the social media problem. But I agree with the use of rationality in discourse to convince. Even in this conversation, I'm going to attempt to use like a rational reason.
Yeah, so that's exactly why we can have a disagreement without being disagreeable, right? Because we can disagree that I bring facts, you bring facts, I bring logic, you bring logic. We try to persuade each other on this common grammar and language. There'll be some extent that we'll be able to persuade each other, but there'll be some extent that we won't.
Yeah.
But then that's fine, because we know why we are not. It's not like I don't like your face or you don't like my face kind of a thing. That's being disagreeable.
Right. You're right. And then maybe the rights bit we can sort of leap through, because I mean, still I'm feeling like I'm not super convinced on many rights being explained through the ownership of reason, that we treat people as reasonable. What about autistic people? Like, there's a whole spectrum of questions. But still, this conclusion is fine by me, that we have to use rationality as the way to argue or to discuss. And then second, that there seems to be some distinction between rationality and reason. What is within reason may not be within rationality. So I was talking to Manoj on a previous podcast, and he mentioned that there is somebody in his RWA passed some sort of a law or something, and then it was repealed. But it was not formally repealed because they didn't want to offend the elderly gentleman who passed it. I feel like that's a reasonable decision. It's not rational. Rationally, the math would say that you want to dot the T's, get it out the way. But there seems to be some incorporation of, and in public policy as well, we see this quite frequently, where states take reasonable stances, where they take into account sentiments of public, religious views they hold, so on and so forth. So they're more reasonable than rational.
I think it's a matter of semantics, because you could argue that rationality and reasonableness are synonyms. Reason and rationality. Rationality is the act of using reason. So that's one tight definition. But what you're talking about is a popular understanding of the word reasonable, which you're basically saying is, let's compromise. Let's agree to compromise. Let's not hold ourselves to very extreme positions. Let's agree to compromise. That's what being reasonable means. In the Karnataka thing, it's like swalpa adjust madi, right? Like,
correct. Yes.
There's an adjust, man.
I'm also thinking about exiting game theory. I think rationality is game theory. And exiting game theory, taking long-term factors into consideration, human elements, emotions, etc., probably falls more in the reason debate. But okay, I hope now we can use rationality and reason to sort of get to the next.
Yeah, I would use that as synonym, right? Because as I said, I'm an electrical engineer, so I would look at it as synonyms. Yeah, you could say that. Look, when you say let's be reasonable, It also means let's use reason, but it also means let's concede certain things to each other because there are larger interests, that we are friends or we need to live in the same community and so on and so forth.
Yeah. Now, the leap to social media. If we think about the state as protecting those rights, and we think about conversations that arrive at public policy as rational/reasonable conversations between people, what is the basis for that consent-centric argument? I'm trying to sort of flesh out why you have a problem with social media as it stands today, and that first bit. If you could go back in time 10 years ago, what would you change about how we do social media?
See, the traditional view, and I think I've one of the culprits of this, right, that right from the mid-90s, both as a student of engineering and then later as a policymaker involved in promoting internet, broadband and communications in general, the view we had was, sometimes now it looks, I could probably laugh at it, right? We used to say that, look, if only people could communicate with each other more easily, they'll understand each other better. And a lot of these problems in the world will sort of go away, right? We said a lot of the problems you have are actually problems of communication, right? People not being able to understand each other because they're remote from each other, right? Once you come into contact, you have daily contact and are more familiar with each other, have greater conversations, things will improve. And I think that is an engineering undergrad's naive view of how the world works or how humans behave.
One I still hold, I think. By the way.
I think those of you who are naive electrical engineers, you can hold it until you're marked by reality. But I think I even remember talking about how a 1% increase in teledensity will increase economic growth, prosperity, and so on. That part of it has worked, right? In terms of teledensity creating economic growth and prosperity, I think that has worked. Where we got blindsided is that we did not know what are the social effects of social media. Right? Interestingly enough, because I think a lot of us were engineers, and a lot of people driving that revolution were also from a technical, corporate technical industrial background, not really clued into the humanities. Right? And the humanities people just got blindsided. Things were moving so fast, they didn't even have time to respond to look at this in a critical, analytical way. Although there were a few people who were critics, but they were always critics of technology. They were criticizing technology all the way, all the way from the railway to the steam engine and all of that. So, I mean, it's just one of the criticisms. So you couldn't take them seriously. But what I think the first thing we noticed, and I have a YouTube video from 2010 or something where I actually talk about it in a conference, is that I noticed that social media was creating new kinds of social organizations, which I call radically networked societies. That you could suddenly form a group online which has an identity of its own, and because it has an identity of its own, it has a politics of its own. And if you look at it from a political science point of view, that's what imagined communities are, right? You imagine communities are, Benedict Anderson's view was that, look, everybody was reading the same language. Then they became French and German and Italian because they were reading the same language, and that caused them to create imagined communities of Germans, French, Italians, and that caused nation states, right? And today we have sovereign states called Germany, France, and Italy. So the same phenomenon was happening online, but in much more diverse in multidimensional ways, right? It was not just along just language. It could be interest groups, it could be politics, it could be geography, it could be the football club that you supported. So I was beginning to see something around 2010, but I think I was unable to sort of extrapolate it, look far enough and say where this is going. Again, because limited by what you know as an electrical engineer. But over time, I think with greater knowledge of cognitive psychology, mainly coming from Kahneman and then Jonathan Haidt and the others, you know that the brain does not work the way it is, right? So if you look at early days of Twitter, when I say early days, I talk about 2012, 2014, it was already an outrage machine, right? It was the only thing which was coming up was outrage, right? Then you reflect back and say news also was like that, because I remember a news editor telling me if it bleeds, it leads, right? The news engine, even the just normal news, television news or newspapers were looking for bad news. Because, looking for gore, looking for outrage, because that's what makes it newsy. That thing came on steroids on Twitter, right? And there was outrage after outrage after outrage. People were jumping from outrage after outrage after outrage. And I used to think that, oh my God, is this a characteristic of our people? Like Indians are like this. But you look at around, the whole world is like that. And then you connect it with what cognitive psychology was telling. It was telling you that intuitive reaction, with your fast brain jumping, right? It's your fast brain working, is what humans normally do. And this is an exact classic case of fast brain, right? An outrage reaction comes from a fast brain, and it triggers you, right? And it triggers you, and it then the social intuition, everybody gets triggered.
Yeah.
So you have an outrage engine, right? And you're talking about that outrage, and then after a while that outrage is dead because a new issue comes, and again your fast brain jumps to your slow brain just does not get enough time to even think of those issues, right? And because of social intuition, your slow brain is ruled out. All decisions are based on outrage, right? And even small issues could just blow up and become outrage things. So what you were seeing even in the 2015-16 kind of a time frame is that large imagined communities being formed. The polarization was an outcome of this, right? You sort of segregate based on what you're outraged about. And Haidt has a very good idea of how moral intuition comes, right? So based on your moral intuition, you are sort of separating yourself. You are creating strong polarized groups. You are jumping from issue to issue. There was no single issue which was discussed in depth, right? It's all about headlines. Once you get the headline, you criticize people for commenting on the headline in a certain way. So why is Nitin Pai not criticizing Deepak for sitting under a banana tree after measles? Nitin, where were you when you commented about Anupam talking about potatoes, but why are you not talking about Deepak and his banana tree, right? And then people descend on me, and that becomes and attacking me becomes a way to show everybody else where you stand, right? It's you're basically signaling your identity. Now, nobody in this conversation had any interest or learning or knowledge about measles and how to eradicate it. It was all about whether on Deepak's side or Nitin's side. If you're on Deepak's side, you'll defend Deepak's side by finding all kinds of logic to show why. If you're on Nitin's side, it's the other way around, right? So that's effectively what it is. Every single conversation on social media has been like this. It has been superficial, and it has been very, very outrage generating, and it makes people interested, right? That's what gets you interested. You go and of course the algorithms, you blame algorithms for it. The people amplified those algorithms because those were ones which are giving them interaction, right? I mean, if you're a commercial company and you want to make money out of this, you want greater interaction so that you can sell more advertising. And what was getting you interaction? Outrage, right? Nothing else was getting you. So you created more and more algorithms, systems, you change your interfaces, you change your use conditions, etc. to ensure that greater outrage and, greater interaction takes place. And I don't blame, these companies for being immoral, at least at that stage, because they were trying to only, build profitability, right? And it so happens that money and revenues were coming from outrage, and they were promoting what was being outrageous. I don't think any of them had time to even think of these consequences till up, maybe 2016, 2017. That was when people started seriously contemplating that. Before that, I would sort of excuse them for all of that because they were trying to learn. But after 2017, when it was, amply clear that there's something is going on, for you to persist in doing that same thing which is bad for society, I think there is culpability there.
So this particular strain of argument, I think, I heard the loudest voices post the Trump election or the 2016 election cycles across the world. I think that's when people most sort of realized. So I want to go into two things. One, you mentioned fast brain, slow brain, and I'm trying to remember a time, and you're older than I am. I'm from the late 90s, so I sort of grew up with the internet and on 4chan, Reddit, and then later, I'm not on social media, but okay, I understand social media as a space. When people did dive deep into issues, was there really a time that existed? Are you contrasting this with a time when, I can give you an example, the Trump election was centered around immigration. It's not a subject I thought about at all. Also, I was fairly young, so my early years in sort of understanding politics. But I remember doing so much reading around immigration policy, and then taking a stance on it myself. As a consequence of Trump, and then the entire social media outrage that followed it. So I would say I went deep into the subject simply as a consequence of that becoming an election issue that would not have otherwise happened sans social media. And then prior to social media is the television years. There was media before that, and the television years were also characterized by this sort of alarmism about it's a box that just gives you information, you can't really interact with it, nothing is deep, it's all 15-minute segments. I mean, is it possible that we're just fast brain animals typically on the political spectrum? We are just carnal in the way that we behave, and social media has not done anything differently.
Well, social media has just played to that, right? Because as I was talking to you about newspapers, every form of medium, every medium or a form of media has played to this fast-brainedness, right? So, like, for example, when radio came, it's not a coincidence that Hitler came to power at the same time as radio was, radio and air travel was becoming easier, because he exploited that, right? So, that's the first surge of, you see radio and you see nationalism growing in, strong nationalism growing in all parts of the world around the same time. So, it's not a coincidence that humans sort of respond to media, right? Because that's how you're communicating with large groups of people. Now, here's an interesting fact, right? I think, again, evolutionary psychology tells us that we are okay to interact with humans, for, our network, if it's 250 people, we are quite okay to deal. We know how to deal with it, right? We know face to face, we can have conversation. Numbers which become larger than 250, 500,000 and all that, you start losing, the connect, right? And your behavior in a group of 1,000 is very different from a group of 20.
Yeah.
You know everyone in your group of 20, but in a group of 1,000, you start sort of waving the flag. Group of 10,000 becomes tribal, right? You have to wave a totem, you become a member of that.
Yeah.
So, all this is well known. What changed is the intensity, the pervasiveness, and the depth of connection which came with the mobile internet, right? In the days of newspaper before TV, you would read the morning paper, you would have conversations with people, you would read the news, right? You would have deeper conversations with people, or you go to your club, or you'll go to your debating society and you'll debate it out. Or your dinner table, or in your canteen. Those of us who've been in college canteens before the internet know that, right? College canteens, you'll have late night conversations going on and sufficient depth, right? If you're in engineering college, probably a lot of physics will come in, equations will come in on all of that, right? We went through that phase, but those are very hard to do now. Because most conversations are on Instagram with a lol or with a emoji and so on, right? So conversations do get tribalized, and it's because of the speed, intensity, and what the medium allows you to do, right? So when you move from a situation where a bunch of people were sitting in a group and talking deeply about an issue, whatever depth that is, to a bunch of people who now have to write 120 characters with an emoji, etc., for engagement, the quality of conversation changes. Now, that's okay if we're talking about what's the latest movie to watch, or what's which team is good in IPL and so on. That's okay. That doesn't have that much of consequence, right? I mean, at least to me. But if you're talking about should there be homosexual marriage? Should we change our laws to allow homosexual unions? And should those unions be called marriages? These requires a lot of depth.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you could argue that, look, this is a question only for the courts to make, and, a highfalutin thing that let policymakers and courts sort it out. Ordinary individuals, white. But as a democracy, you need to know. You need to have,
based on these things.
Yeah, you need to have views on this, and you need to have sort of reasoned views on this, and you should be exposed to other points of view. This you don't get on social media.
I'm so surprised, and I'm thinking about exactly the opposite. So a few things. One, in the quality of discourse, take the electoral bonds issue that has recently emerged, right? The average YouTuber is creating content that is at least 20-25 minutes long, is filled with citations, and typically citing, I mean, I'm not saying they're not biased, they're all biased in their own ways, but that is not new to how we sort of do politics. But it's quite nuanced and detailed. Now, I know this YouTube video sort of gets copy-pasted onto like a Twitter and then gets shared. And then there's only 140 characters there. But I suspect that there's no real, there's not as much of a loss in depth and nuance as you are estimating. In fact, I can also think about how if somebody in the opposite camp says something, it's now so easy for me to access that. I don't think the Twitter bubble blocks out its existence, because usually somebody will say, hey, so-and-so said this and it's against what we believe as a camp. And then I'm going to go and watch that video or read that piece. The number of videos on subjects have gone up exponentially. The number of, and on all sides of the issue, the number of articles from news agencies, traditional media, on the internet, the average number of articles per day has exploded as a consequence of the internet. And it's all completely new sides of the spectrum. Average word length is about the same, so it's still as nuanced as it used to be. If this is the specific issue, that it's you sort of have extreme tribalism and close groups, I don't know if that's really how it's played out. I mean,
but that's what I'm saying. It's not that which is being discussed. There's a meta. You see, the discussion is not about the issue itself. It's about others' reaction to the issue. So what's happening is, oh yeah, you've created a 25-minute video. I've written a 1,000-word op-ed on it. The number of people who read it is probably 1% of the number of people who retweet it and comment on it, right? Very often people just look at the headline which is on the Twitter thing, and then they respond to it. And they also know, okay, this person is a left-winger, right? And he said this. So immediately you respond to that guy with his name and the kind of argument he's made without reading anything in the thing. So, you know, it's the same. So the number of people who actually watched a 25-minute video was the number of people who are commenting on it and having that discourse is vastly different, right? So, yes, it is true that technology has allowed a lot of us to comment, right? A lot of us write 1,000-word op-eds, make 25-minute videos. You're doing a podcast, right? So there is opportunity to create depth in that conversation.
Right.
And that opportunity is being used. But the ability of that kind of content to actually influence public discourse and therefore policy is that much smaller, because public discourse is not concerned about the content of our conversation, but the headline of that conversation, right? And the identity of the speakers in that conversation. So, for example, in this particular podcast, I think a lot of people won't know whether you're a left-winger or a right-winger. You know, they won't know where to stand. They won't know whether to criticize or not. Maybe they'll be forced to actually listen to the whole thing and say, okay, let's see what did these guys say.
That's the secret idea behind the format.
Yeah, but most of the time, there's already a, Republic TV has already taken a position, right? And the guy he's hammering is already on the other side. You already know what position
But as did the Hindu and Times of India.
But there was nuance, Yeah, although, Hindu was a paper which I mostly disagreed with, the editorial position which I still mostly disagree with most of the time, still had spaces for intelligent commentary by people who were not necessarily on the same side, right? The Indian Express, for that matter, the Times of India. I'm talking about roughly up to the year 2005, maybe 2010 also. This is what the situation was in the news. Even now, newspapers do have op-ed columns which they allow people and they invite people from the other side to write about it, right? But I don't know whether people read those newspapers. People don't read those articles. They just look at the headline and they say, oh, this is what this guy has written, so it must be he's on our side or he's on that side.
And I want to go to the meta layer, right? Because this I understand, and I mean, in my head, I'm still trying to figure out how the percentage of people who care deeply about an issue and want to be nuanced about it has not really changed. Those folks would read a headline on a newspaper, but not read the article.
That number might have increased, but the number of as compared to the overall size of the public discourse is still a small fraction.
As it was.
Maybe it's much smaller than what it used to be.
But don't you think the headline reading types were still headline reading in the days? In fact, they may just hear about it from somebody who says, hey, this happened, that happened.
But they didn't have the power to amplify that. Right? Today you have a power to amplify that. Okay. When you look at the Twitter trend, for example, I think a lot of politicians will be looking at Twitter trends. Right? Yes. And now they look at a Twitter trend which says that sit under a banana tree to cure measles, right? And I'm sure there'll be some politician who will say, yeah, why not I back this idea, because it seems to be popular, it's trending. Even, no publicity is bad publicity, right? So why don't I just embrace it? Because even sitting on a banana tree is going to get me news. I'm going to be visible. So why don't I embrace that cause? And
the distinction here is, one of these is incorrect information. There is no scientific evidence, and it can be objectively proven, right? Because science, in the domain of medicine, you have a clear scientific path to getting to an answer. That sitting under a banana tree has no scientific evidence that it cures measles. Versus a political position, which is I'm pro-immigration, anti-immigration, pro-abortion, anti-abortion. These positions, which is heavily subjective, has always been contested. There is no in humanities, there's no real soft sciences, right? There's no real scientific way to get to an answer. You have studies and papers, but that's as far as it goes, because you can't look into the future, and so you don't know how people will change. I'm still trying to figure out how is this an issue? Like, what is the problem here? So I'm amplifying it, but in the real world,
because democracy is only as good as its discourse, right? Your democracy is good when your discourse allows you to bring up all the pros and cons. Even as you said, for example, immigration, right? These are political issues,
Right.
or these are value positions which societies take, or or even rights for homosexuals, right? Homosexual unions.
Right.
It's a social issue. It's like, science can tell you certain things, but for that science to surface into that, it's part of the social debate. Whether society accepts that way of view or not. Now, for that, you need a public discourse which allows various types of information to come up and contend with each other, right? And if you have now a system which deliberately, systematically opposes a certain kind of, or suppresses that, right? Or your own biases add up, society's biases add up in a way that it suppresses a certain kind of information, which might be valuable to making that decision, then you have a problem, right? So you need a democracy, therefore, functions best when its discourse is good, right? Which all forms of views can come up. They have, that's why Parliament exists, right? You can question, have debates in Parliament about all points of view without any, parliamentary privilege also, right? You can have no holds barred. You can have conversations like that. So the design there is that democracy improves with the quality of discourse. Now, what happens is with social media, discourse is the first casualty. Because you can't have reasoned discourse. When was the last time anyone went onto Twitter and said, look, let's have a debate on some important issue? You go onto Twitter and say that I stand for banana tree under, measles for banana tree, support me. Or I oppose that, so Nitin is against this thing. I go there, and so we are contending with each other, right? We have bunches of followers who follow us and who fight with each other on this. There is no debate happening. There's no reason being used, right?
As opposed to when was the time when...
I think in the past it was always like that, right? You go to a debating society, you would go to television debates were like that at one point.
But I suspect debating societies today have more participants and more debates than ever in history.
In India, you would say before the anti-defection law came into force, which is the mid-80s, Parliament was the site of debates. There were people in the ruling party which would question the ruling party's views. Even this happens in other parliaments, right? You have in parliaments where there's no anti-defection law, there's no whip. There are ruling party members who question the decisions of the thing. So there is, democracy is built on discourse. It's just that anti-defection law 84 killed it politically, and social media has destroyed it in now. I give the example of. This is an electrical engineering metaphor. I don't know. Those of you who are not electrical engineers, too bad. But, current looks for the shortest path to ground.
Yes.
Right? So, conversation and political ideas also look for the shortest path to ground. And the shortest path to ground is through social media, through Twitter. So, why would you write a 1,000-word op-ed when you can tweet it? Right? Because immediately, it's instant gratification. Thousands of people see it and you get feedback on your tweet immediately. If I have to write a 1,000-word essay, I have to write 1,000 words, I have to get it published. And after that, someone has to read it and then someone has to give me back feedback and say, I read it, right? So, that loop is much longer. But I would rather tweet.
My pushback here is that if you have a bell curve of people, I'm sure that there are some folks who will read a headline and then stop at that. And if you do just that much, which is you're doing just tweeting on an issue, then you will isolate your audience into that small 1 to 5% of people who are content with reading a headline. But there will be that 6th percentile of people who will respond to that thread saying, yeah, but where's the source? Or can you give me a more detailed article? And there'll be a new creator, journalist or whoever, who creates content for that second pie, which is, I also think about this in the terms of podcast. Who's going to really listen to this, right? And there's some pie within that entire spectrum who want to sit through a 1 hour, 2 hour conversation about a particular issue. This is not new. This is human. There have always been that spectrum distribution. And just to try and make the point you're making, your case for this is amplification, which is that if I'm in that 5% who only read headlines, now I don't stop at simply reading the headline. I also retweet it, and so more people who follow me or who are in my bubble or who are under my influence now have access to that headline as well.
It's not just amplification. It's what I'm saying. It's meta. It's not about that issue. Remember, I said this. It's not about the issue. What you are saying, your scientific analysis, your logical analysis, none of that really matters. Most of this conversation is about what people are saying about what you're saying. Right? It's not about the article which Nitin wrote. It's about what people are saying about the article that Nitin wrote, or where Nitin stands in the political spectrum. What is his identity basis? Who's this guy? right? What has he said before, right? So is he on my side or is he on the other side? That's what it is. Because once that happens, and that's exactly what Haidt talks about as social intuition, right?
Yeah.
Once that happens, you're not looking at what he's saying. Headline is just is a proxy, right? But most of the time, you're not examining the arguments. You're just saying, okay, is he there or then they'll say, oh, you're trying to pull a fast one, right? A clever one-liner. Say, I trapped you, gotcha. You're gotchaing each other, right? Instead of saying, look, what is this guy saying? This guy might be a guy you deeply disagree with. Maybe I've always disagreed with this guy. But maybe on this particular issue, what is he saying? Do I know what he's saying? Have I understood his arguments? No, right? Now, to take you back, the Indian tradition of debate, right? Now, this is what a lot of Indians themselves have forgotten. I mean, we ourselves have forgotten, right? The Indian tradition of debate starts with something called Purva Paksha, right? It requires you, in all these scholarly debates about Upanishads, whatever, right? It's not just religious and spiritual, it's also philosophical and economics, any subject that you look at. The Indian tradition of debate requires you to do a Purva Paksha. That before you go and criticize the other guy, you must make the best form of his argument to show that you understood that point of view. And if possible, you should do it in a way that guy exceeds the way that guy made it. So, let's say Nitin is a bad debater and you're debating Nitin. You should be able to make Nitin's argument better than Nitin has made, right? Before you go and deconstruct it, right? That was the level of, decency, decorum and standard expected from a conversation on serious matters in India, right? And for good reason, because that's the only way you can actually bring out, the facts, and you can have you can isolate the facts and you can have a intelligent conversation. Now, of course, that's a very high standard, right?
Yeah.
But here at least you're saying, look, can you read what the other guy said? Can you examine his arguments dispassionately, right? You can't, because you have only 30 seconds to look at it, because you have to scroll through the next one, right? You can't read that article. It's not that you don't want to. You put it in to be read later, read it later, whatever, right? You're not going to read that, save it to pocket or whatever. You're not going to read that because there are a lot of other things you have to go through, right? And that jumping from outrage to outrage, issue to issue, having a huge backlog of things to read. If you're a conscientious person, you'll actually do that. You'll save it for later, read it later, save it to pocket, right? Put it in your reading list. And one fine day, in the fullness of time, you're going to read it. Most often, you're not going to read it, right? Because you have another issue that you have to tackle. That's what I'm talking about. So, maybe if you look at it as a intelligent conversation as a fraction of overall public discourse, that fraction has gone very, very small. That fraction matters.
And who, I love this. The question I have is, who lost? So, is it the folks who would have done the deep dive, who would have Steelman, Purva Paksha, people who've now descended into the realm of headline reading? That's what you contend has happened.
At the margin, yes, because you're rewarded by that, right? Because if you are in public discourse, both your brain and society around rewards you for being a personality on social media, not for having deep analysis of, weasels under a banana.
Which is the second bit. I think your meta-analysis was, it is now not sufficient to speak about the issue. You also have to be somebody who people are willing to read, or your subset of people are willing to read. So you're playing two games at the same time is what you're contending. The first is researching the issue and all of that. And the second is how you present it in such a way that your public persona, because you're thinking about how people view you, but as the author, you're also constantly thinking about how you present yourself and to whom.
Correct. So in a way, you could say that. Like, you have to worry about what you say and also what other people say about you.
Yes.
Yeah. And that second part is hard to control. The easiest way of that is to, sort yourself into tribal groups and, share it with your buddies, and your buddies know that you're on their side, and then there's, RCB kind of thing.
Correct. Yeah. Okay. And then I always thought about people as resting on multiple axes. Right? So you and I may agree on some subject, but we may disagree on some other subject. So it's quite hard for two people to be alike on everything, which is on every single political issue, every single social issue. We all agree on everything to exactly the same degree, right? That I won't go. The Overton window is exactly the same for both of us. In your estimate, is that happening with social media? That is, when you start to agree, you start to agree with somebody on some issue, and you enter the tribal group, then there seems to be some sort of a forcible change on positions on all issues. Otherwise, you lose the tribal group. Because again, here I'm not buying it. I still think that people I may be part of your tribe for a particular issue, but I'm not part of your tribe as a matter of identity. I'm willing to exit the tribe if it means on a different issue I'm part of another tribe.
Then you're an exception. I think most people sort themselves into tribes. Some are very strong members of the tribe, some are weak members of the tribe, but they're members of the tribe nevertheless. Because it also is a matter of survival. Because if you're set upon by a bunch of people, you need someone to defend you. And if you're in the middle, you would be one of those guys, right? Who says, look, I'm independent, issues matter to me, not the identity. If you are attacked, no one's going to defend you. And the attacks on social media can be severe, right? There are cases of people committing suicide and all of that, because losing jobs, committing suicide because of the kind of attacks that they suffer. So being part of a group makes sense. It's rational to be part of a group online, because others might be deterred from attacking you because they know you're part of a group. And in case they do attack you, you do have your tribe which will jump and counter-attack and support you. So that's why tribalism is a consequence. There are, of course, exceptional people at the margin who might say, look, issues matter to me. I'm a Republican, but I have a different view on abortion. Yeah, you do exist. But when it comes to, push comes to shove, you have to take positions, they'll, sort themselves into Republicans and Democrats. I'm using a US analogy because I think we can be a little more dispassionate about it, right?
And I'm thinking about, again, trying to figure out pre-social media. You would still have to identify some sort of a tribe. I think you would contest that either people are more nuanced about the tribes they pick, that they're doing.
And you didn't know how big and how strong that tribe was. You didn't know. Your ability to organize. Let's say you follow a particular person on social media, and that person has 30 million followers. You know that your tribe has 30 million followers. And let's say that person advocates a particular form of politics. You know that particular politics has 30 million followers. When you were reading newspapers, you didn't know. So there was a greater incentive for you to make up your own mind, because you didn't know how many people are out there. So when you go to vote, you actually didn't know whether this party is going to win, that party is going to. This issue is as salient to the people as it is to you, right?
Is the opposite true, that I was in the earlier world more influenced by my immediate surroundings? So I was enslaved to the political views of my father, my mother.
Correct.
But now that is no longer true.
That's true. To an extent, it's gone. But the difference, therefore, is this is what I talk about in cascading, right? This is again another thing which people have found out. Information cascades in large networks. So that 30 million becomes 300 million just because there were 30 million people there, right? Because a lot of people, they seem to believe this guy, so he must be right in some way, and therefore I'll follow this guy. So that 30 million becomes 60 million and it becomes 300 million very quickly, right? Information cascades through society, which didn't happen in the old uncle, auntie, family kind of thing, right? You believe what your family does, but it doesn't really cascade beyond your neighbors. But in large networks, it does. So that's the risk, because now, again, remember I talked about rationality. You're not now voting on the basis of your assessment of the pros and cons of a particular position for you. Forget about for society. Like American women who voted Republicans and found out that there's abortion-related problems, right? Now, you should have thought about this. Everybody knew that they have this position on abortion and Roe versus Wade and so on, right? And many women want abortion to be available and pills to be available. Yet they voted Republican. Why? You have to explain that, right?
Yeah, and this is exactly what I wanted to sort of bring up. It may not be rational, but it's entirely reasonable. Why is it unthinkable that voting based on tribal identity, and they seem to do it, supersedes voting based on nuance on an issue?
Well, that's not what the prospect of democracy is, right? The democracy prospect, why is it that we believe democracy is a great idea? Not because people vote according to their tribes and their castes, right? We believe that democracy is a great idea because everybody is an individual and therefore will vote in that individual's best interests. If you were to tell me democracy is because people sort themselves into castes and each caste member will vote according to what the caste interests are, then I would say, why would I want to give a system where everybody has a vote, right? We just count the number of people in each caste and then we decide, ask each caste member, where do you want to stand?
But this is my pushback. There are two issues. First, people did sort themselves into castes in India, for example, but they rested differently on different axes, which is not on every subject would I agree with my caste. And then second, why is a democracy about the protection of my own interests? So, on the example you gave on abortion rights, people who are pro-life could make the claim that it's not so much their own rights that they are concerned about defending. They make the vote because they want to defend somebody else's right. In this case, they in their estimate, the fetus is an unborn child, is human and hence has rights. So is the hypothesis flawed? Why do all votes have to be in my own individual best interest?
See, the argument is not that. The argument is democracy is seen as a great system. Liberal democracy is seen as a great system. I use the word liberal democracy, right? Because you give rights to people. Liberal democracy is seen as a great system because individuals can, it offers individuals a way to express their individualism through a vote. That is one person, one vote, right? Which is why we give one person, one vote, because that each individual we consider as an important. But if the reality is that they don't vote as individuals at all, right? And you can look at numbers, you can look at data analysis. Even in popular politics in India tells you, right? Why is it that people are cobbling caste coalitions? Right? I mean, we say we are all against caste, but during election times, it seems to be quite kosher to talk about ABCD caste combination, CD caste combination, this person has this caste vote.
Correct.
Right? If people are voting in blocks of caste, then the prospect of democracy was false, right? So they sold you democracy saying that individuals will vote. But what people are doing is entirely different. So you're getting outcomes which are not what liberal democracy is cranked out to be. That's the point.
Yeah.
And it's not, caste is an example from our past. But what if, I'm using what if because I don't have data right now, but what if social media is strengthening those things? In any society there's going to be, at any point in time, an individual is going to decide, should I have greater fidelity towards my group, or should I think more of an individual, right? This is the oldest form of politics.
Correct.
So a group wants to keep itself together and therefore has certain norms, rules for an individual in that group to behave. And the group also needs to evolve, so there is an amount of divergence possible because an individual, when he thinks as an individual, breaks the norms of that group, can do innovative things. So there's always this balance. So an individual always has to decide whether you have to be a little more groupy or a little more individually.
Yeah.
Right? What we have now seems to have thrust, an individual deeply into the groupie domain. Not to think of yourself as an individual at all. Right? Which is why people are upset that, somebody was insulted, some leader was insulted, some institution was insulted, some temple was insulted, some mosque was insulted. Because, they're not thinking of themselves. It's just like you insulted a totem of my group.
I'm trying to actually make the other case that a part of my individual identity is in some part, all my group identities. So I am a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian. I am a farmer.
You are a Tamil.
I am let's say a Tamilian, right? Or I'm a capitalist or I'm a socialist.
Yeah.
All of those groups that I identify with are part of I of course have my own private interests as well. I have private property, the road I live on, my family, those are also interests. I may be disabled, but I'm also in part all the groups that I'm a part of. And you said earlier that social media has strengthened those group identities.
Not just those group identities, it's also created new group identities.
Yes. And I feel more comfortable and safe in these new groups that I have.
Great. I mean, I'm happy for you. But what I'm saying is that it's once that group decides a set of, once a group makes an opinion on a set of policies and all members of that group have to sort of conform to it, maybe even willingly, then I think game's over, right? It's not democracy anymore.
It's not democracy anymore. Okay. What is the incentive of the state to regulate? This sounds
regulate what? Regulate social media?
Yeah, I mean, this sounds incredible, right?
Well, there are
every politician has hinged on the fact that you can group up people.
See, there are two. Again, I don't like the word regulate because it seems to suggest throttling or whatever. I would use the word govern. Right? So, why do you think what role does a state have in governing social media? There are two answers. There are three answers, but the first one is a procedural one. Taxes and this, that, and the other. Where do we pay taxes?
Yeah.
Data localization, all of that kind of stuff. That's a technical thing. But more deeply, there are two reasons. One, let me peel the onion, right? the outermost layer of the onion is these taxes and all of that. The second layer of the onion is the amount of power, political power, a social media platform acquires because it becomes dominant very quickly, right? So after Elon Musk taking over Twitter, I don't need to explain this to anyone, right? That now Elon Musk is a politically powerful player.
Right.
Why? I mean, what's the reason that he has that much of political? He can swing an election, right? Democracy was not cut out to have one person or one entity or one company to have that kind of power, right? Why do we have anti-monopoly laws, right? We have competition laws. Why do we have competition laws? Why do we prefer competition? Because we believe that concentration of power of any kind in society is inimical to liberty, right? So that's why we don't go after General Motors or AT&T because we don't like a big company. There is a reason. The reason is that you don't want concentration of power.
Right.
Concentration of market power is bad, but very often concentration of market power also leads to concentration of political power, right? Because then these guys can actually influence policy. In the case of social media, they can influence all kind of policy, right? Earlier it was just a cartel, it was influencing oil prices or automobile prices or telephone charges. Now it's like, so you have a problem, right? And it is a real problem. There is empirical evidence to show that people who own companies and individuals that own platforms have political power, which is way beyond what you can imagine, right? And that's bad for democracy. So that's one reason to intervene. The second reason to intervene is what I was talking about, right? Like, it goes to a level of cognitive autonomy of citizens. The citizens' freedom to think is challenged by social media networks because a citizen is not able to exercise free judgment. The citizen now is subject to algorithms, but those algorithms are not, again, as I said, the algorithms are not necessarily evil.
Yeah.
But the algorithms have the effect of snatching away your freedom to think. Because today everybody in Bangalore is talking about, I don't know, what's the news of the day? I don't know. But
Water
it's all
issues in
engineered, right?
Bangalore,
It could be rains or flooding of Dubai or whatever, right? Very innocuous example. But we've all spent our time thinking about flooding in the state in Dubai because algorithms, everybody is talking about it, right? It's not out of my own volition. I can't have a conversation with you about, I don't know, flyover on Inner Ring Road, right? Because no one's interested. The whole meme, the whole conversation is about something, right? And that setting of that agenda is just, it's done by social forces. It's done by platform. It can be manipulated, right? Cambridge Analytica and others show you that can be manipulated. So, there's disinformation, all of that. There's malice. So, no need to go into the details, right? But what I'm saying is that the freedom to think, basic cognitive autonomy of a citizen is taken away, right? And that's, I was a part of a conversation with a bunch of people about the freedom to think. And there were two schools of thought. One school of thought was saying that, look, we need to create new statutes, new principles, new laws, new international treaties to protect the freedom to think. The other group of people are saying that it's already there. It's already implied in our constitutions, in our existing Bill of Rights and so on. And we were going on this, and I was thinking, look, which country actually has the freedom to think as a fundamental right where it's written in the constitution? I was looking at most countries don't. You know which country has that?
Mm-hmm.
The Republic of India. In your liberty, in your preamble of the constitution, is liberty of thought is right up there, right? So you are obliged to protect the liberty of thought. And if you now think that certain forms of technology are creating conditions where the liberty of thought, the freedom to think, is being diminished or impeded upon by technology, I think the state has an obligation to correct it. Now, how you do that is different, right? Because then the state itself must act in ways that promotes liberty. Because your medicine can't be worse than your disease, right? So you can't have regulation or you can't have laws that worsen the fact. But I'm an optimist in human genius. I think we can find policy ideas, frameworks, principles that allow us to promote liberty, cognitive autonomy, ability to think, even in the face of the kind of challenges that we face.
The train of thought I'm still drawing on this is something like, I thought my way into social media. That is, I downloaded the app, I knew what I was getting into. People who are on social media are sort of voluntarily part of those bubbles, and in fact would prefer it if they had sort of these voluntary bubbles. I know that there's some research work now on how people stay only because others are on the platform. There's some sort of addictive element to it. But by and large, I'm still sort of broadly concerned about the use of consent, because this seems more like you're likening social media to alcohol, tobacco, cigarettes than to television, newspapers, right? Or an amalgamation of those two that's sort of insidious to the way it's presented in society. But we're short on time, and so I think that I will do the last question that I typically do all our guests who come on the podcast. If you had to step into my shoes, right, and you're to speak to somebody who makes the case for more regulation or governance on social media in general, what would the counter argument be? How could you steelman this, or like you said earlier, Purva Paksha, in a way that you would do this better than I would do it myself?
See, I think the biggest challenge is this: if you're using the state as an instrument to govern social media, is that the state should have the power you should be equipped. You should have the capacity to power to do this job well. And when you're giving the state the power to be able to determine what people think and what people can think, what's to prevent the state from using it to put wool over your eyes, right?
Yeah.
So it's like the state can very well make you believe a certain set of things. And states have strong interest to make you believe a certain set of things. For example, the necessity of the state itself, right? Every state, because it wants to survive, wants everyone to believe that the state is important and essential. You can call it patriotism, you could call it nationalism, you could call it whatever, right? The loyalty to the state and so on. So what's to prevent the state from doing its own propaganda, right? I think this is the fundamental conundrum, that if you think that the state is the agent which will check transgressions of social media and protect your liberty of thought, what is to prevent the state itself from grabbing your liberty of thought? And we've always seen through history, states, any political actor, right, wants to actually is a battle for your mind.
Yeah.
And it's always been that the state is, every form of state has tried to control your mental frontiers. And it's nothing to, liberal democracies can do it as well, right? So how do you prevent that? And that, I think, is a challenge. But as I said, now this is where the Purva Paksha ends, and I come back to myself, right? And I think human genius is capable of finding an answer. But you can find a solution only when you frame the problem and accepted that there's a problem. I think we are in that stage. That, look, not everybody believes that there's a problem. Not everybody is agreed upon that, look, social media is going to be as dangerous. Jonathan Haidt, I think, is, all hats off to him. He made a very important argument. He said that a lot of people were countering him, saying that there's not enough evidence to show that this social media is as bad as it's made out to be. He said, look, a lot of dangerous things, you don't have to wait for the full evidence to come, especially if it's existential, right? So I think he's made a strong case to persuade people of the nature of the problem, with providing enough scientific evidence of the harms it's created in various aspects. But I think we have to go through that journey of all democratic societies, have to understand the nature of the problem. All parts of the political spectrum should know that this is a problem which affects them as well. Because earlier, usually what happens is, in the early stages, one party decides, hey, this is actually to my advantage, so let me play it.
Yes.
Right? So it takes some time before you realize that, okay, this is a bad thing for everyone, so let's take action. I think we have to wait for that point. And at internet time, that point might not be as far away as we think.
And what does action look like?
I have no idea at this point. I mean, I have some ideas, but not for this podcast.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is that we don't know the correct answer. We have to stumble towards it. That answer has to evolve.
And it won't be too late to regulate. I mean, they'll innovate so fast that...
That's the reason why we should find an answer before we do crazy things like putting chips into our brains, right? That's a different, we should be able to find that answer before we do things that might prevent us from ever finding an answer.
Okay. On that note, Nitin, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's wonderful.